Center for Inequality Dynamics at University of Michigan. She received her PhD in economics from Columbia University in 2019 and was a postdoctoral associate in the Economic Growth Center at Yale before moving to Michigan last year. Her research focuses on economic history and spatial economics with big data. Substantively, her research considers how urban development, particularly through transit infrastructure policy and land use policy, shapes inequality, racial segregation, and intergenerational mobility. To address these topics, she has worked extensively to implement machine learning and GIS-based approaches to connect large-scale survey, administrative, and organic data sources. She is a recipient of the Best Paper by a Junior Scholar Award from the American Real Estate and Urban Economics Association and the IPOM's Research Award, which qualifies her as a demographer. So thanks very much for being here. Welcome, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Sorry? Okay, thanks everyone for coming. Well, my title is When Cities Grow. It's still happening. Well, let's see what insights we can learn from this pre-war United States and the urban planning and segregation, maybe an intertwined process. So my motivation of this paper, it's not clicker, doesn't work. Oh, I see. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So, well, let's start with how we are doing in terms of segregation in 2020. This is New York City in 2020. Well, the very city or neighborhoods that is hailed as the melting pot of everything together. Well, if we look at this map segregation, as you can see from, this is racial dot density map. Different colors represent residential population. One dot here is 500 per residential population, 500 persons. As you can see, well, New York City seems pretty segregated in terms of who are, it's not the daylight time where people are in and out, but in terms of residential patterns, we still see sort of different color or different racial groups are living in different parts of the city. And then the one question is, these 100 years of urbanization seem to have led to this extensive residential segregation. What explains that? So I turn to this time period where 1870 to 1940. Well, it's a long time ago. It happened 100 years ago. But still, let's take a look. New York at the time was a young city as well, that it was the period of unprecedented economic and population growth. But at the same time, most importantly too, the canonical examples that we call as an urban planning were also implemented. So to namely, we were building the subway construction, like they're building subway, connecting neighborhoods everywhere. But at the same time, this may be something sort of a little bit, one may argue, but I would say the nation's first comprehensive land use regulation was implemented in the 1916, which is during the study period. So imagine a city that in the beginning, if you look at the size of the city that is highly populated, the geographic size of the city was pretty small. But also you do see the green dot and red dot next to each other. In other words, it was fairly racially integrated place in 1880. But then as the urbanization progressed, what do we see here? The geographic size of the city that people live with high density, it expanded a lot thanks to subway that reduced the spatial frictions. But we also see where are red dots and green dots next to each other? Sort of the urbanization process, and then we also see a high degree of segregation. So then let's just time travel and then use this big data with population census of everyone. Some of your ancestors may be also in the data. Let's understand the same racial dot density map and then see how the segregation process sort of progressed over this time period. I would like to emphasize these two statistics in this blue box, which is one is about population size of the city, and the second thing is about how segregated the neighborhoods were at the city level. So, well, in this audience, I do not have to go further what segregation means or segregation index means, but I use this as a racial segregation index, white and black, African Americans, and also using this similarity index. So now, as you can see, segregation index being 0 is perfectly integrated, 1 being maximum, perfectly segregated. So 0.4 segregation index being kind of moderately segregated, but not severely segregated at all. As you can see, and here are the policy changes, as you can see. I'll go faster. So basically, as we move further along, you can imagine how subways was also built along the city. So the population kept increasing. But what we also see is that as time went on, you also see, so did the segregation index. So in just 50 years, we started with a population just above 1 million with moderately segregated neighborhoods. And then you reach, by the time that the red dots all funneling into a couple of neighborhoods in the city. Yes?
Could you please define the segregation index for me?
Yes, great question. Segregation index, I have a slide later, but let's just like...
I can wait.
Okay, let's wait 3 minutes then. Okay, and then if I'm not clear... Thank you. Okay, so here's my narrative. So what do? So I am providing this, you're right, that how do we actually understand then segregation index? Is it really socioeconomic segregation or is it racial segregation? What I presented, you're right, here it measures the racial segregation because I am showing how racially things have become more segregated over time. But I also measure the socioeconomic segregation. How do I do that? This is the power of IBM's records, right? So 5 years ago, they also documented their occupation and industry. So having said that, it's not just the white and African Americans, but it's also how socioeconomic segregation can be captured using their occupation and industry variables. So now, what I capture then is that I can now also measure where lawyers or high-skilled workers were living versus sort of manual worker or other blue-collar jobs were. And then how socioeconomically those workers were segregated as they built the subway. So building subways is a great thing. It reduces the spatial friction within the city. People can move in and out of the jobs. So it reduced the whole spatial sort of frictions within the city. However, what you also see immediately as you build this sort of spatial infrastructure, transit infrastructure, is that you see a geographical sorting by households. I think we had a meeting this morning. Is this like a bad thing? I wouldn't say a bad thing, but the geographical sorting of households. Probably it's not so uniquely New York either. You reduce the friction. Before infrastructure, imagine that you were working in sort of Lower East Side or some downtown or Wall Street, whatever that you are doing, you were really constrained by sort of the transit mode. You don't want to walk 10 hours to get to your work. So you are sort of like living in this tiny island. But then one day, subway opened and you can pretty much live anywhere you want to live. And then you can still get to your workplace in 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And the fares were very affordable and cheap, right? Then what you see is this immediate jump of geographical sorting by households. So there is working class neighborhoods, there is a rich neighborhood, blah, blah, blah. In sociology terms, neighborhoods became stratified. The emergence of stratified neighborhoods is documented shortly after the short subway arrival. Then what I document here is the following. Then you study the subway and then zoning and how should we really understand. These are really two big things. And I totally agree with you. These are the two main public policy changes within the city. what I document here is this. Zoning may not have been that neutral in some sense. That is a key takeaway. What do I mean by that? Because zoning basically assigned what are the neighborhoods or locations that could be built for single-family housing and leafy street, and what are the areas within the city that could be built for factories or multi-dwellings and things like that. And then, so it governs not only the density, but also the land use. In such sense, it is the nation's first comprehensive land use regulation. Because think about DC, someone who is spent some time in DC. Boston and DC already had height-related regulation, that you cannot build that higher than this for whatever reasons. However, it was the very first attempt that the nation or government has a control over land use, that certain land use or purpose buildings for factories or certain activities cannot be done or built for this location, whereas certain activities could be allowed in this location, assigning, quote unquote, what are desirable neighborhoods and what are not so desirable neighborhoods. So in some sense, you could imagine how these two can be reinforcing factors that kind of intensifies the segregation process. Yes?
Was this done based on actual neighborhood or by block, or is it done by group of city blocks, or do you know the geographic size of the land use ordinances that are?
Okay, so
by law?
yes, great question. So it was down to street level.
Okay.
It was especially, imagine you're the developer or landowner. This matters when you can build this high building or that high building, right? And then what kind of land use? So it was really down to street. So maybe there is a reason why this was the first paper that studies this nation's first zoning, because if you see all the paper that I had to geo-reference, nightmare, right? So all down to street level, and it does matter whether you are facing this street or that street, and that all mattered, right? So then the short answer is yes, down to street level, and then it matters which side of the street that you're facing to. And so it was very detailed decision, and then if you're asking also another separate question, what is your geographic unit of analysis? Then I would say a neighborhood. Then you may ask, what is a neighborhood? I'll show you that in a minute. Any other question? Yes.
In the maps that you showed us,
Yes.
if somebody had lived in staff, would they have been listed as that resident?
Great question. Domestic workers. Yes. So in this, I included the domestic workers. But even if you exclude the domestic workers, it basically has a very similar patterns. And I wonder the same thing, that is it because domestic workers were living here and that's what's going on, but that doesn't seem to be going on, at least in my case. Partly probably because New York was already industrialized, so people were not exactly working right next to the people or working with the family that they're working for or something. But this figure includes the domestic workers, but it doesn't really change the result. Any other questions? Okay, let me move on then. So basically, here's my narrative that combination of building the transit infrastructure and then implementing the nation's first land use regulation seemed to be a very powerful combination, leading to both socioeconomic and racial segregation toward the end of the study period. Then here's sort of how I place this paper, right? So imagine when you're thinking of suburbanization, kind of something that crossed your mind probably would be post-World War thing. It is after the redlining that, and after the car and automobile that we have suburbs and all that. But well, let's think about, are we looking at the right spatial unit to understand this process? Sort of that was how I started this project, that if cars can drive fast, but there must be a mode of transit and the correct spatial unit that correspond to that. So in other words, so far, a lot of papers on suburbanization and post-war sort of period were looking at highways and cars. And then naturally, the spatial unit that they were measuring these were at the city level or county level. But if you look at also size of Philadelphia County, it is pretty big. So if that's the unit that we are looking at 19th century, maybe that's not something, there is a disconnect of how people were walking or commuting, and also county being the spatial unit. So in other words, if we use granular data, high resolution data, to look at what was going on in terms of how segregated the neighborhoods were, probably we should look at more high resolution data. Then the question is, how do we do that? And then this IPUMS data is really an appealing candidate. So down to street level, how people were living. And also you can then aggregate at the neighborhood level, having this time consistent boundary, and then see how people who are living there, how the racial composition of residents were changing over time. Then we can get a more higher and more accurate picture of whether there was segregation even well before the post-war period. And then my paper says yes. So it is not just a pre-World War thing or post-war phenomena, but segregation or suburbanization was well underway well before the post-World War period. Then how do we really also understand this neighborhood level segregation sort of process? So then the vintage Zillow, that's how I would like to call it. The 19th century, you can call it, or I would like vintage Zillow data that I constructed from the origin, from the archives. I spent 2 years or 3 years of just scanning those books. Then how then this vintage Zillow can tell us something about this housing market, or how this high frequency data can tell us something about neighborhood changes. Okay, so let's go. So here is a big literature, and I'm so happy that, yes.
One question, could
Yes.
you elaborate more on the nature of the zoning ordinances? I mean, I think one possible zoning ordinance is that you cannot operate certain types of business in an area. You cannot have a factory in the area.
Mm-hmm.
Another pertains to the density of residential construction.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably others. What's the nature of the zoning ordinances on which you're focused?
Right, so.
And if it's 3 slides, I can wait.
No, it doesn't need to wait 3 slides. So short answer is, I actually looked at the following. There is an outcome variable that we care about, which is the segregation measure. And then you're absolutely right. Is it the density, or is it the height, or is it the land use? What type of land use regulation that is pertinent to segregation outcome we are looking at? And then according to econometric analysis, it seems like land use is the only thing that is highly correlated with the socioeconomic and racial segregation. But you're right, that it's not just the density or height, but it was the land use that has to be highly correlated with segregation measures. There already was a finding that, I thought it was the bulk zoning density that matters in a modern context, the bulk and density related thing. But when the zoning was just born, it turned out to be the land use. Any other questions?
So you pretty persuasively showed that the segregation happened.
Mm-hmm.
And then you identified these 2 causes, the subways and the zoning.
Mm-hmm.
But the actual mechanism,
Mm-hmm.
is it like rising housing costs that push the Black families out of into segregated areas? Is it the housing, or what caused what was the mechanism?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. This is where I am spending a lot of time also. How did the housing market look like when those neighborhoods were going through tipping process? My short answer is, provocatively, it wasn't really the housing price was going down, like during the tipping, well, let me revise. It seems like there is a lot of behavioral component. That's a more correct way of seeing it. So what do I mean by that? Is that you see suddenly a lot of those properties are being sold to the same buyer that has CORP, Corp, or something related. So because I can see the buyers and sellers name, so when the tipping process is going on, what I typically see is that the individual homeowners probably is concerned with the expectation that, oh, my house is going to, my value is going to fall. So you see this sort of behavior of individual homeowners selling to a large corporations. And that really propagates the process. But it's a little preliminary finding so far. But happy to talk more about those. Yes.
Yeah, kind of related to that, I'm wondering, the literature also like talks about, particularly in middle class, upper class, like particularly white residents, as soon as they have subway or transportation outside of like dirty like cities, so the idea that they want to leave like the inner city, and so the idea of like bedroom kind of suburbs created. So I wonder if that also had something to do with like particularly upper or middle class residents leaving like the inner city. I don't know if you want to maybe like expand on that.
So so are you thinking about the migration or?
Yeah, just thinking about the mechanisms of how did it become segregated. There's readings on like how particularly middle class residents left inner city areas because once there was transit available, then they could leave and create bedroom communities and bedroom suburbs. So I'm wondering if that had...
No, this is a great question. So I'm not going to present that part of the thing, a paper, but I'm happy to talk more about that. But it's really addressing internal migration. So when the transit infrastructure enables people to sort into or live, almost pretty much anywhere, then who are the people who are leaving the very, central part of the city, right? And then maybe that explains this tipping process. You're right. So at least when it comes to African Americans, what I see in the data is, well, African Americans, it's not just one job or, it's just the poor, African Americans. No, Black doctors, Black lawyers who are living different parts of the city. But what really is notable is that as the city gets severely segregated, it doesn't matter what the socioeconomic backgrounds are, but they all sort into the one neighborhood that's extremely segregated. So that's something that's in the data, and that can be done by following the same individuals over time, right? So that is something. The white migrant in migration is a different story, because you're right that there is the reverse pattern, right? They were all living in a very central part of the city, but they sort of like migrate into different parts of the city. What explains that? Better schools, better neighborhoods. Well, yes, something for the future research. Any other questions? Okay. And I would like to sort of like summarize this thing. So there's a huge related literature, and then in red, I emphasize what this paper's contribution is. So there is a huge literature on racial segregation that really tries to explain what is the segregation in US cities, trend, for example, but relative to these other papers out here, what I try to show is that neighborhood level segregation, unlike the existing notion that segregation being post-World War phenomena, that it began as early as 1910s. So we should look at the right spatial unit at the time. And also then, how do we understand this? So I got this question earlier in the morning. Well, how should we really understand how neighborhoods become segregated? Is it like everyone is a racist and everyone wants to just live with people who are like very similar to yours? Or even a very small preference that I I don't mind living with people with different backgrounds, but maybe I don't want to be an absolute minority. That kind of Schelling model type of a very mild preferences can even lead to a very shockingly segregated outcome. How do we understand this sort of, what is the mechanism? This is something that I believe that housing, high frequency housing data can tell us something about it, because there is a lot of behavioral component as well. That there is an expectation, you are a homeowner, you do not want to sell when it has fallen so much. So is it like how those sort of behavioral components and then high frequency housing data may be able to help us answer some of those tipping process. And then in here, our second part of the literature is on urban planning policies and infrastructure. Especially, there is a huge papers and research out there. Does urban planning and infrastructure matter? The short answer, yes, it matters for city growth. However, it also may have, perhaps it also helps explain the rise of segregation as an unintended sort of quote unquote, unintended consequences of segregation. Okay, so here's an outline of my talk. So let's actually talk about some of your questions has to do with the data. Why then, I get this question all the time. Why are you sure Glaser didn't study this? And let me show you why it has taken a long time to answer this sort of like, answer this question. So let's think about this. Conveniently, so far the studies, existing studies or existing work uses county or city level data to analyze segregation. Why? Partly because it's very hard until IPUMS really released this sort of data. It was impossible to have more higher resolution or granular data. So demographers really revolutionized how we are thinking about neighborhoods by bringing this higher resolution data. And then when the data can be taken to GIS or this sort of GIS software, now you can see not just at a data as a table, but you can see exact locations of which family was living and what is the socioeconomic background and racial background, and then down to geo-latitude and longitude. And then you can construct that what kind of public policies changes were happening around the study period. So imagine that what infrastructure network looked like in 1900, 1910, 20 is very different. So you can then combine using this geospatial sort of processing, what kind of neighborhoods had how many density of subway network and stations, and also who was living there back then as almost like a subway was expanding like a spider web. Then how those population census from 1870 to 1940, every 10 years, how the composition, as you could see from the racial dot density map, how those compositions were changing every 10 years. And then finally, well, 10 years frequency may not be that frequent enough, right? Then what about weekly frequency transaction level vintage Zillow that tells us how the housing market prices were changing as all these policy changes were underway. So by combining all this data from machine learning and geospatial processing, so it more delivers a comprehensive picture when the suburbanization or urbanization process was underway, how the incremental changes of segregation process was happening and how. So this is sort of the snapshot. It started with 1870, and then the building of subway and elevated railway was underway. However, the nation's first comprehensive zoning regulation, what kind of role it played in sort of in intensifying the segregation pattern that we see. So very long-winded answer. So what is a neighborhood? Here are the answers. So this is time invariant, right? So the boundary of the neighborhood is fixed, and then we are always trying to map whatever population census or whatever that is. We are trying to see, okay, here is what could be a good neighborhood? Lower East Side neighborhood, and then we know the Lower East Side neighborhood boundary is fixed. Then who was living there? whether the Italian immigrants, whether the German immigrants, or someone else, that we can see always. There, I just follow the New York City's Department of City Planning's definition of what neighborhoods are. Of course, you can, isn't it very endogenous? Can you try different definition of neighborhoods? Of course you can. But this is just one definition that I stick with it, partly because it's easy to interpret how neighborhoods were formed, and then how even the same neighborhood, the sort of composition of residents were changing over time. You see that there are approximately 200 neighborhoods that I consistently follow for 70 years for everyone. And then population, how many people were living in this neighborhood, it can vary as little as 15,000, but also it can be high density neighborhood with 0.1 million residential population per neighborhood. Why then different colors, right? So let me explain. So, well, you can imagine there are sort of very central neighborhoods. You could imagine these are the these were where people were living and working in the absence of transit network, right? People had to sort of like, when city size was geographically constrained because there was no other way of getting around the city, then this is where working places, and then home places were all sort of next to each other. What really happened when the transit allowed people to move around the city, what you see in the data is that jobs stayed more or less. But it was the home location that got spread around the city. So I would like to call this sort of a city core, and then the surrounding area as city periphery. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so then what kind of like data then I take it to answer or construct this database? Here's how I understand or explain why Glaser probably didn't do this yet. But John Logan is trying to do this part of it, and so let me not overclaim what I have done. So here, for example, it's one of the neighborhood boundary here that you see, but then for you to follow the same neighborhood over time, you always have to overlay the sort of enumeration district boundaries, where they were. Are you all familiar with historical census? Okay, so maybe one very straightforward example could be something like, suppose you found your ancestor and then they were living in Brooklyn enumeration district number 1 in 1880. You have no idea where enumeration district number 1 was, right? You may know the street, but even street name kept changing over time. So then how do you know? So this is where the magic happens. There is a National Archives, and then they were having all these maps that are all over the place, and then there's an enumeration district boundary, and then you keep overlaying that year, and enumeration district boundary keeps changing over the 100 years, and then by overlaying that with the neighborhood boundary, you can then exactly know where your ancestors were living, and then consistently following them. And then you have to do this for every census year, because the boundary keeps changing over time also. Then why do I do this? Because there are two things you can achieve. By having this sort of consistent time boundary, you can then this is the same boundary, and how did this neighborhood change over time can be done accurately only by having this time invariant neighborhood boundary, right? But at the same time, someone asked me about internal migration, then you can do something similar that, okay, here's a neighborhood boundary. Someone named, what is your name? Andres was living in neighborhood 1, right? And then what is the neighborhood B that Andres seemed to have left? Or maybe he had stayed put. But if we don't know like exact location of those neighborhood, what enumeration district location means, then I cannot exactly have a complete understanding of this internal migration process either. That's why this process seems to really matter. It can be a very technical way, but also by doing so, I can see your internal migration pattern, that someone was living like just outside of Harlem neighborhood, but now after the zoning, we are documenting someone individual's migration and economic mobility patterns as well. By following the same census, not census, so suppose Andres, I see Andres following the same Andres 30 years. I see you in 1900, 1910, 1920, and 30. Now, a lot of related questions can be answered too. Suppose Andres now, sorry, I'm giving a hypothetical example. Suppose you had moved into this sort of disadvantaged neighborhood. Is it a bad, is it a bad thing? Like in terms of your economic outcome. If one lives in a segregated neighborhood, then do we see the occupational segregation as well? And that kind of questions can be best answered by not only identifying the neighborhood, but also the whole history of the neighborhoods that you are living and migrating from and to. So those sort of efforts had to be made to follow not only the neighborhood, but also the individuals. Okay, so I think you had this question about what does really zoning mean, and then how does the assignment work? So I would say that this is how the map looked like. But this, addressing your point, zoning could mean different things, and it actually had three components. This, what it captures, is the height regulation. So, for example, this means it cannot be built very tall, but on this side of street, it can be built like skyscrapers, basically. It can be very tall buildings could be built. But then, how do you really translate this kind of maps all over the city to this? This is the power of geospatial processing, that by following the same street, that you can then exactly know green means residential, and then red means basically factories could be built. So how down to 73rd Street and Park Avenue, what kind of residential or what kind of use or height-related regulations that were in place, and then you really follow the neighborhood, and then how the housing prices or the other segregation-related measures were evolving in relation to this.
The overall zone is just designed for like larger blocks, like for it's not like someone being evaluating from 47 to 49 on Fifth Avenue. It's that for this chunk within Midtown less than that.
Good question. So in terms of height, it was done in chunk. You're absolutely right. Your intuition is absolutely right. But when it comes to land use, it seemed to be the latter, that it was surveyed very carefully and then down to street. So it was much more granular decision. Probably it was a bigger decision too, right? That whether it is going to be built for, look at like all these assignments. It was very done at a much more granular, not in a chunk way. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, I'm not doing very well on time. So, well, the key takeaway here is that, well, here is how the sausage was made. So you may wonder, well, how did you create the vintage Zillow data? Well, here's my thumb over here. So, a lot of like scanning. So imagine something like pre-internet. This is how people were understanding housing market, whether you're a real estate developer or government person or something. All the housing related information was reported in these books. Then you can see how conveyances records were documented as well. That what is the street, what is the size, what is the characteristic of the house, mortgage amount, and then here are the estimated value, assessed value, and then the market clearing price. So you can really see these sort of pages and pages of those, and then it becomes 2 million data points. And then you can see how those sort of housing price index was changing by neighborhood. So it's not just one neighborhood, it's all neighborhoods that I just showed you, 200 neighborhoods over 70 years, and then how these sort of home prices were changing.
So New York has a huge portion
Mhm.
the sales block there.
Right.
Is that included here, or do you know what fraction would be excluded? if it's not?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer. Partly because the housing, like census of 1930 asks something about are you a renter or are you not a renter? That's the only census year that really asks about the, I think, the renter status. So it is a little harder for me to really understand the tenant ratio, but I can talk about that, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give, speed up a little bit. So yes, well, how did the segregation measure, what index was measured? So this is the similarity index. What is the intuition? Let's go to the intuition. Suppose the city has 2 neighborhoods. And then also at the city-wide level, suppose 50% of population is white, and then the other 50% is non-white. Then let's understand how this uneven the distribution, the population distribution is based on this distribution. So Philadelphia has 2 neighborhoods, 50% white, 50% non-white. Then in a perfectly integrated neighborhood, all neighborhoods, let's say neighborhood 1, would have the same distribution, just like the city distribution, 50% white, 50% non-white. Neighborhood 2, same thing. Then we are living in this zero segregation measure because the neighborhood composition, in terms of racial composition, is exactly similar to the citywide segregation, citywide proportion of racial groups. However, imagine something completely different, right? We know that Philadelphia has 2 neighborhoods, 50% white, but then in this world, neighborhood 1 has all white, and neighborhood 2 has all non-white. It's perfectly segregated, and it's perfectly different from the citywide distribution. So that reaches the 1, according to this formula, right? So then how this kind of gives us a sense of how, say, severely segregated or not so severely segregated, sort of like this measure. Then what I'm going to show is that by combining all these census data into the time-consistent boundaries, now I can look at these outcome variables of interest. So what am I really looking at? So in this econometric framework, I'm looking at this neighborhood boundary, right? Like these are time-consistent, time invariant, and then there is a neighborhood level balanced panel data for 70 years that captures the 3 things. It shows the residential population, how many people were living there in each neighborhood, but also how the socioeconomic status of residential population changed over time in different neighborhood I at time t in relation to subway arrival. So, and then finally, how did the segregation outcome also look like as the subway arrived in each neighborhood? So I'm going to look at three different things. So for example, this SI takes 1 if it ever had a subway connection in the neighborhood I ever. So there are some neighborhoods that had never received any subway, right? And then I of I tau will take the following. It will capture the timing of when the subway arrived. So there may be some neighborhood that subway arrived well before 1900, and it was really well connected. But there may be some neighborhoods like Queens that the subway arrived much later, and therefore it made a huge impact. Then this beta is capturing what is the sort of average, what is the average treatment effect coming from subway. Whereas, if we can think about this, imagine sort of really well-connected area. Some areas that I showed in red, which is like city core, the impact that it must have had due to the subway arrival may be quite different from a very remote area getting the subway arrival. So what is the sort of heterogeneous sort of treatment effect that the subway arrival must have meant in terms of understanding the outcome? So what we basically see is the following, that not so surprisingly, let's look at the timing. This is post-subway arrival. This is pre-subway arrival. what we basically see is that once the subway arrives, not so surprisingly, we see a population increases everywhere. However, what you also see is that it's very hard to read. Sorry. Okay, here's two different trends. In terms of understanding population dynamics, remember there are 200 neighborhoods. One is being red and very central, and then there's periphery neighborhoods. In periphery neighborhoods, this is what we see, right? So population increases once the subway connection arrives. However, the opposite seems to be true in central neighborhoods, right? Subway arrived, people left, right? So it becomes really empty. So you can imagine the city is going through a very different population dynamics. One was gaining a lot of population, as you said, and then at the center, it's like people are all living. It's almost like San Francisco during pandemic, right? People are living. Then what we also see is that, well, what about then the socioeconomic status of residents? That when all this subway arrived, and then people were living in large numbers, think about it. It's like, if you look at the numbers, there was a really significant population decline, 20 to 60% in poor neighborhoods. I now live in the suburb of Detroit. Even in Detroit at the worst time, they were losing 12% of population per decade. So imagine losing 20 to 60%. It was a very dramatic decline. And what about the overall socioeconomic status of residents? Well, maybe the really wealthy people stay. That's not what we see in the data. Basically, once the subway arrives, you see a persistent decline of SEA in terms of residents, especially in the central neighborhood. So imagine something like this. The city core, once the subway arrived, it was the worst possible shock. People were leaving, and it was getting poorer, and then the periphery or suburbs was gaining all the population increase, and the socioeconomic status was also changing. It was really some shift, right? There was a real shift. And then what about segregation? What we basically also see is that after the subway arrival, we see a gradual, persistent segregation index was also increasing over time. So then we can kind of wrap up that subway arrived. It may be a great thing in terms of reducing the spatial frictions and then promoting city growth, but it was also losing its population, and then also the resident composition was changing between city core and the periphery, very systematically. And then what did zoning do, right? All these things were happening. What did zoning do? And then, in other words, think about this. Let's forget this. But imagine you are 1910, you time traveled, you became the Robert Moses back then. You can choose what kind of land use assignment or zoning regulation you can put in. What kind of big data can you use? Because I love big data, but I don't think big data is new at all. People use it as a brand new. No, big data has been there all the time. But like, imagine the big data back then was 1910 census. It was everyone. Then can you predict? Imagine you had the 1910 everyone census. You know where the rich people, where the poor people, where African Americans, white people were living. Can you assign, or can you predict what the Robert Moses kind of a planner must have done? Right? That's a different way of thinking. Whether was zoning so endogenous or just like was assigned at random, right? If it was not assigned at random, it must have a predictive power, right? So that's what I find. Basically, zoning was assigned not at random. That what was the most important factor that determined this good neighborhoods or not so great neighborhoods? Share of African American population, the numbers mattered, and also the socioeconomic status of residents in each neighborhood. In other words, if the higher the resident's socioeconomic status or income, then it was much more likely that it was assigned for residential where factories or activities with negative externalities were not allowed. And also the higher share of African American population, that it was much more likely that it was assigned for factory use or something with negative externalities. So the main takeaway here was really zoning was an endogenous response to the socioeconomic segregation that subway facilitated. So interaction of the two, so let's take a quick look. The 1910 census. This is how the zoning was attributed, like assigned. Unrestricted was like basically industrial use. Residential was the leafy street. And then business was where factories are. So you could see how spatial distribution of those economic activities and zoning. So let's look at 1910 census. This orange line or orange parcels are where the sort of high SES or rich people were living. Let's look at the zoning assignment, how they're correlated perfectly down to street level. This is exactly addressing your question. Well, is it a coincidence? Probably not. In the econometric framework, then we can also see what type of zoning and then relative to, unrestricted, which was largely industrial. Just summarizing this, what we are finding is that the higher share of African Americans, then it's much less likely to be assigned for residential, which is the leafy street. But on the other hand, the higher socioeconomic status or the higher income the resident's income is, then it's much likely also that it gets assigned for residential purpose. But then how do we understand the tipping process? Someone asked me during the meeting that depending on the zoning assignment, do you see a really different sort of like dynamics? Yes, this is what, let's take a look. So this is 1910, how the northern Manhattan looked like. This is Central Park. You can sort of see that like blue dots are white population and African American population are in this yellow dots. And then the zoning was assigned accordingly, like here, one left side of the street or park, residential, and the other side, Harlem mostly, here is business district or factory district. Once zoning came in 1916, and this is population distribution of 1910, let's see how 1920, it's almost like Christmas lights turning and then turning again. So what do we see here? People have this notion, or there may be a notion that tipping process may be very gradual process. But what is very clear from these is that this sort of how the transition of racial group can be very sudden. It happened just in 20 years. One neighborhood that was less than 5% Black becomes 50% Black in 1920, and then 93% by 1930. So it's a very sudden process. Then how do we understand this, right? So this is where I show that, well, then when the change, well, how is it different from gentrification then? How is tipping process different from gentrification? I would argue that the ratio, when neighborhoods gentrify, it's one almost, you don't have this sudden population decline per se. It's a replacement process. One family leaves and the other family comes. But do we see that while in the tipping process? That's not exactly what we see. So for example, let's take a look in 1910. This is capturing white population change and Black population. So basically, in some parts of Harlem, African American family came, and then this red bar here on the left captures, so this is how much white population left in the same neighborhood. What happened shortly after when the tipping was mature? What we see is basically one Black family arrival is associated on average 3 white families leaving the neighborhood. So it was a very sudden, leading to a sudden population decline. Then leading to the final sort of question that I got, how did what is the mechanism, right? That was the mechanism. How did the house price change? because there was all these 2 million records. What does it really reveal? So in here, the gray dots are based on assessed value. This is why assessed value and sales price, they're not the same thing, right? There's a larger gap between the two when the housing is really going through this sort of sudden declining process, because according to the assessor value, it should be going up, right? However, for whatever reason, what we see here is that the house price is consistently going through the declining process. And what do we see? Just like this tipping process, there seems to be a spatial spillover as well. What do I mean by spatial spillover? Imagine it started with this part of the neighborhood, and then it became like even the neighboring neighborhoods go through some similar process. That's what seems to be in the data in the housing market as well. So we are identifying, using this econometric framework, that when did this house sales price index sort of, when do we identify the structural break? 1916, for this neighborhood, where it all started. The whole tipping process started in Central Harlem North, and shortly after the zoning was announced, this is when we see a consistent decline in sales price. But just like the spatial spillover had a neighboring neighborhoods also had gone through the similar declining process, but with time lag, that's what we see also in the housing data. Yes, so it was identified in 1916. Something like, imagine you're a homeowner, you see Harlem North was declining. Over time, that's what you see. There was a time lag, but still we also see that just like the yellow dots and the residential population was changing, sort of moving here and there, we also see similar process that housing markets seem to go through the similar process. So, well, what do we see? So let me just quickly conclude. So this is something very much ongoing process. So this is why I said the findings are very preliminary, but I can talk about them later after the talk. Why should we care? It happened 100 years ago. But let me come back to that. Growing cities invest in urban planning. And then zoning, somehow, however, the little attention has been paid of what may be the unintended consequences of this like planning zoning, or this sort of, could there be some consequences that are unintended? However, well, and then additionally, current efforts of desegregating neighborhoods, in my opinion, it really heavily evolves around redlining. But I would like to emphasize that redlining for sure must have done something. But there must have been policies well before redlining that may have contributed, whether intended or not, that may have contributed to the segregation. Here's what you care, why you should care. Once the nation's first zoning was implemented in 1916, as you can see from this article from New York Times, Philadelphia also appointed a zoning committee, and then 200 or other 500 American cities quickly adopted the similar zoning practices. Learn from New York, okay, this is great, we should learn and then do the same thing. So by 1920, 200 American cities or more also did a similar practice. This is really well embedded in our American neighborhoods, so probably we should care and then think about these unintended consequences. Thank you.
Thank you, so it takes us right to 1 o'clock, so thank you very much.
Thank you.